Hello and welcome back to Final Friday, where I go through my records in alphabetical order like a big nerd and talk about why I love them. I say alphabetical, but actually this is a Beatles week, so we're going back in time to B, and we are still on Rubber Soul, so this is our third Rubber Soul week, and that means that we are listening to this song. Now you'll find that this song, like every other song on the album, is great. My story with Rubber Soul, which I am surprised I hadn't gotten into in the previous 2 weeks. When we were living on the boat, we met some other sailors on a different boat who found out that I loved the Beatles. I got Beatles Anthology as my first Beatles album. I think what happened is my parents had been complaining to this other couple that that was all I was listening to and that I was crazy about the Beatles, but they were sick of listening to Anthology. So they made a tape of Rubber Soul and Revolver for me on one of those old Maxell cassette tapes. For years, I thought that Rubber Soul and Revolver were a double album because one album ran straight into the next on the tape. They promptly got sick of me listening to that as well, so this was the first album that I ever listened to with headphones on. They found some that the previous owner of the boat had left behind along with all of his other worldly belongings. They handed me this Walkman and they said, go outside, put these on, listen to them outside. When this song started, I legitimately thought that Paul McCartney was standing behind me and I did this huge double take. Trying on headphones for the first time is a trip, and I'm really excited that I remember that experience. It's very special. What's your first experience with headphones? That's one of my questions to you. The other is, do you know of any You Won't See Me covers? And if so, do you have a favorite? Now, I see this song as being sort of quintessentially Rubber Soul because everything about it signifies that they have matured a little bit from what they have been in previous albums. As some of you pointed out in the comments, there are hints of them growing as musicians and as people in previous albums, especially Help, the one before this. And to be fair, Help and Rubber Soul only came out a few months apart. They were in the same year, which just blows my mind because they just developed so much as musicians in a matter of months. It's just wild. Some musicians never evolve over the course of their career at all. They just keep putting out the same music. Sometimes that's a winning strategy. These guys did not do that. They were chameleons. I'd like to think that's because they weren't satisfied with just sticking with something that they've mastered. I think, at least while they were together, it feels like they were sort of genuine music students. They didn't have any technical training as musicians, but that doesn't mean that you aren't a student of music. I think any musician who has curiosity and a desire to become better at their craft is a musical student. And I'd like to think that, to some extent, that throughout their tenure as Beatles, they were seeking to learn and grow, as this album is a great example of that. And this specific song is a great example from this album. Why do I think that? I'm glad you asked. I think there are two reasons. I'm going to interrupt myself again, which, as you'll know, I never do, to just point out that they're like between 22 and 25 years old. So when I say they're maturing, they're still kids. Try not to let it demoralize you too much as a musician. In retrospect, this seems overly dismissive, so I would just like to point out that 22 to 25-year-olds are still adults and have, in most cases, had valid life experiences. Right, so two things. The first is that they are maturing as people. You know, they're not 19 or 20 years old. They are now 22 to 25, approximately. That's reflected in their lyrical content. They're not in the kinds of relationships that they were singing about in earlier songs, like Wanting to Hold Your Hand. They're not singing about, like, Say You'll Be True, She Loves You and You Know That Can't Be Bad. You know, a lot of the thematic content of the earlier songs is kind of juvenile. I don't think that that diminishes the quality of the song. We need juvenile songs in the canon of 20th century Western music. This song, as I understand it, is about a relationship that is failing and the two people involved can't make it work. They don't necessarily understand what has changed, but it's not working anymore, and despite their best efforts, it's not coming together. Falling in love with someone at 16, where it's like a really passionate experience, and you know, you might have a really sad breakup as a result of that, but it's very different from living with someone and suddenly feeling like you don't know them anymore. And that's what I feel that this song is about. So there's growth in that. They're singing about more emotionally specific and nuanced situations than the simpler stuff that they were singing about in earlier songs. The second thing is the instrumentation. The chords are pretty simple, but the instrumentation on the song, I think, is very intentional. Each of the individual parts that the Beatles are playing are interesting as individual components, and they contribute to this more musically interesting whole. Let's start out talking about the drums. In earlier songs, I've mentioned this in the past, Ringo used to just slam the hell out of his cymbals. And it gives a lot of their earlier albums a sort of noisy impact. It has a really youthful energy about it. It's loud and it's kind of rebellious. This song is not that. It's not noisy. Ringo's drum part is deliberate, and it is, relative to that, completely understated. And you can hear that sort of rambunctious, cymbal-heavy sound even in the previous album on songs like The Night Before. But this drum part is just a little bit more involved. It's like a written part. He's not just playing by feel. Here are some elements that I think are decisions, they're choices that have been made musically. Here's one. So it's like a dun 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 tick tick. There's like a tick tick. He's got that signature digga 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 dig, which he does at the beginning of Drive My Car. So he does it again here. Editing Nancy, can you just play that clip again, because I can't find it? Here it is. Yeah, so Ringo's doing ornate embellishments, shall we say, on the hi-hat. There it was. Never mind, I can find it myself. In some, Ringo's playing drum parts that are a lot more detailed, more subdued, but also more frenetic. It's not just a constant beat throughout, it's doing different things. I will point out, though, that he slows down during this track, which is a big no-no for a drummer. I'm learning so much tonight. Apparently, it slows down because Paul McCartney's piano was what led the performance and what dictated the tempo of the song. So it wasn't actually Ringo's fault at all. Ringo was very good at timekeeping. Paul was not as good at timekeeping. That is why the song slows down. Let's move on to the piano part. I really like the piano part as well. I think at this point in the Beatles' career, 1965 specifically, you start to see a lot more piano in their tracks. This is a very sort of Paul plays piano track, and there aren't as many of those in the previous albums. There are some songs that have piano in earlier tracks, like Not a Second Time. You know you made me cry. But there really aren't that many. Whereas after this, you've got like Good Day Sunshine. Good Day Sunshine. Lovely Rita, Martha My Dear, Lady Madonna, etc. This album is sort of the starting point for that. Let's go to our piano correspondent, who will show us in a little bit more detail what the piano is doing on this track. I sure can. A thing that is interesting about the piano part is that you can find all of the backing vocals of the song within that piano part. This is how the piano part goes. Which in context sounds like this. When I call you up, your cool piano part. Here are what the backing vocals are doing. So that "You won't see me" happens in the verse in the piano part here. Da, 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 da. So there's that little chromatic run that happens in the verse. I might be overthinking this a little bit, but I kind of like to think of it as it's just a little bit of musical forecasting. Here is a motif. We're going to repeat it later, except it's going to be in your face next time because we're going to be singing it. Da, 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 da. It's the same as "You won't see me, you won't see me." Same harmony. You've probably had enough of Piano Correspondent Nancy for today. Piano Correspondent Nancy is about to go have lunch. Goodbye! Okay, the next thing I want to look at is the bass part. As I've mentioned in earlier Rubber Soul episodes, I was the Paul in my Beatles cover group Elementary Penguins, Auckland's Illustrious, and this song presented a particular challenge for me for two reasons. The first is that Paul's kind of ad-libbing the bass line. He's improvising it as he goes. So he has a basic structure around which he's writing the bass line, but he's only using that really as a point of reference and doing something ever so slightly different every time, which makes it really difficult to learn it note for note. Eventually what I ended up doing was taking the same approach and improvising around those chord structures. This is the basic pattern of the bass line. Also, for those of you asking whether I played with a Hofner bass, those are extremely expensive instruments. No, I played Paul McCartney with this lime green, beautiful monstrosity. Carlos. He plays around with those structures, but yeah, it's a little bit different every time, which is really cool. It's a similar thing to what jazz bassists do when they're walking a bass line. It's not a written part, they're just improvising around the chords. Soloing light. It's cool to see that Paul was doing that. I think he probably always did that to an extent, but this is a slightly more complicated bass line by comparison against, like... Although you could argue that the first song on the first album has a pretty cool bass line. So, I don't know, maybe I've just disproved myself. Maybe he was always a very gifted bassist. No, I think a lot of people make the argument that his bass lines became more interesting over the course of the Beatles, because even this one has nothing on, like... which of course is something in the way she moves attracts me like no other lover. Which brings me to my second complication with the song. While I was improvising these parts, it was difficult to sing on top of them. As you practice this as a bassist, it becomes easier. But it had been a while since I'd last played bass in a band when I picked this instrument back up for Elementary Penguins. In the previous band, it had been a covers band, and so I was accustomed to singing and playing bass, and I didn't anticipate that it was going to be challenging. But I was out of practice, so I went to the first rehearsal fully expecting to be able to play this song and sing it at the same time, and it was a total disaster. My brain would either sing or it would play, but as soon as I tried to do both, one of them would fold. Either manage to keep up the bass line or keep up the singing, but yeah, I couldn't do both at once. When I call you up, your line's engaged. I guess I still remember how to do it. That's the bass part covered. Last thing to mention instrumentally is George is doing a similar, I think it's George, is doing a similar thing to what I described during Drive My Car, which is that it's doing this very heavy 2 and 4 emphasis. It's become not so much a melodic instrument as a rhythmic instrument. Just makes it a bit more rhythmically focused and gives the song its groove. Especially given that Ringo's doing some more ornate stuff, it's really useful to have the yeah, so the rhythm section's really working nicely together. We've got Ringo going 1 da, 1 da da da. We've got Paul going do 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 da, do 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 da. He's syncopating his bass line. George has no option almost but to do something very, very straightforward, and it creates room for the other two to be a little bit more playful. Last couple of things to mention about the song. Paul's vocal delivery is really lovely. I'll show you what I mean. It sounds like he's anguished. Act your age. This is where the backing vocals come in, which, if she did her job properly, piano correspondent Nancy will have covered. The way that they're singing ooh la 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 draws attention to the backing vocals. It's very much like, hey, we're doing a cool thing with the backing vocals, have a listen to it. Otherwise they would just sing ooh. Instead they're singing la la la. Very call and response sort of an approach, which you see a lot more in music of African origins, which you could argue that rock and roll is. Call, response. Paul plays the wrong note there. I don't know if this will come through. If it doesn't, go back and listen to it. I think it's probably somewhere around 1:20. That's everything from me. Thanks for hanging out with me. I will see you next week, and I hope you have a good weekend. Bye! More musically interesting whole. Not like a hole, but like a W hole. WHO. Never mind.